Like I mentioned, my name is Kathy Kresol, and my day job is working as a manager at the Rockford Public Library. I am the manager of the Rockton Center branch. And um, in my spare time, I like to run around in the back roads of everywhere and look for dead guys. I fill my time with that. So on the screen in front of you is a picture of me in a cemetery on a nice snowy day so that you can get cool because it's not cool outside at all today. And the other picture is one of the tombstones I found in a really small cemetery outside of Lincoln, Illinois. So I will be sharing some of the stories today. I've been researching this area's history for 15 years plus, and these are some of the quirky, weird ghost stories and ghastly crimes that I have uncovered in that time period. So let's get started. The first one we're going to talk about is not only known in the region, but really all over the world. It's the mysterious death of Daniel Stott. This takes place in the small little town of Garden Prairie in 1881, and it made a big splash, and it continues to be talked about even to this day. Daniel Stott was just your average American Joe working in the for the railroad company. He was the telegraph officer, kind of, and the railroad agent in Garden Prairie at the time. He lived in a nice big house right across the street, so he just walked over, did his thing. In 1881, Daniel is about 60 years old, and he had been having some problems with his health. He suffered from epileptic seizures, and he needed some help around the house for that reason. And he hired a young lady, very attractive. Her name was Julia, and she came from Chicago. And so she came in and was helping him around the house. And to put it delicately, she worked her way from the kitchen into the bedroom, and then they were married. She was 30 years younger than he was, but again, she was attractive. She was very helpful. And she had a friend in Chicago that she had met who was a doctor. So Daniel was having these issues, and she really encouraged him to go see her friend. He only met this doctor once. They traveled into Chicago and met Dr. Neil Cream. Like I mentioned, Julia had known him before. So after they did that first initial meeting, Dr. Cream assured Daniel that he could help him. And Daniel felt like he was getting better. In letters from that time period to family members, he said, yeah, I can feel that I'm getting stronger and not having the seizures near as much. So the treatment was working as far as Daniel was concerned. And in June of 1881, Daniel had run out of his prescription. So Julia, and this was their habit, she would take the train into Chicago, spend the night, visit with some friends, pick up his prescription, and come back the next day. And that's what happened. She arrived at home. He had run out of the prescription, so he was a little behind when he should have taken it. But she gave him the pill, and he took it. And within 20 minutes, he was suffering from agonizing stomach pains, and he was vomiting. And shortly thereafter, Daniel passed away in his home there in Garden Prairie. The house still stands, in case you're curious. So that should have really been the end of the story. Everybody was very saddened by Daniel's death, but it wasn't exactly unexpected because they knew he suffered from these seizures, and they knew that they could be very, very detrimental to his health. So that's where the story should end. Daniel is in his grave, and the story moves on. except shortly after Daniel's death, there was a letter that arrived to Dr. Frank Whitman there in Garden Prairie. He was the county coroner at the time. Now, this letter came, first there was a couple anonymous letters that everybody just kind of ignored, but then this one came and actually came to him. And Boone County coroner, it was addressed to the Boone County coroner. So Dr. Whitman gets it and he reads it and he's very curious. So in this letter, Dr. Cream, who had been treating Daniel, suggests that Daniel's death looks a little suspicious. He said, I was treating him. I know what he was taking. He should have been rebounding now. So he thought there was something wrong with the pills. And what happened was, and he suggested this in his letter to Dr. Whitman, was he wanted to suggest that Daniel should be exhumed, taken out of the grave, cut open, take his stomach out, take some of the stomach contents, and please forgive me for all of those animal lovers out there, feed those stomach contents to a stray cat or a dog to see what would happen. So Dr. Whitman, wanting to be a thorough doctor, went and did exactly what Dr. Cream had asked. He dug up Daniel, took him, he sent the stomach itself to Rush Medical in Chicago, but he grabbed a stray cat from from Garden Prairie area, and he fed them the contents of Daniel's stomach. The cat started to have a seizure. It started to vomit, and within a very, very short time, that cat died. The medical people at Rush Medical had done their tests, and they came back that there were 4 times the amount of strychnine that would kill a man. So it was very, very deadly. Now, Dr. Cream wanted to have the people who made the pills up. He wanted to have the pharmacy company, put under arrest for poisoning Daniel, and he really pursued having Julia, who is now the widow, Stott, do this with him, for Daniel, to get justice for Daniel's death. And the police officers in Boone County and the coroner were very curious about this. So they wanted to talk to the widow, Stott. So they brought her in and they started to question her, and her demeanor just wasn't quite right. So they started to question her even harder. And within a very, very short time, she said that she had collaborated with the very handsome Dr. Cream here. They had actually put this whole scheme together even before she married Daniel. They had been lovers, and he and her got together and decided that she would go and seduce someone that they could, poison and kill. So she sang like the canary, and everything came out about this plot. Well, they put him on trial. He was found guilty, and Dr. Cream was sentenced to he was sentenced to life in prison and sent on his merry way. That's not where the story ends again, though. Within 10 years, Dr. Cream came into inheritance, and somehow, all of a sudden, his life sentence is commuted and he's let go after serving only 10 years for the murder of Daniel Stott. He goes to London, and shortly, within a matter of weeks, women start dying in London seems that Dr. Cream would approach these girls that the newspapers delicately called daughters of the pavement. He'd approach them and say that he had this pill that they could take that would guarantee no pregnancies. Excuse me. And he would give the pills to these girls who would then suffer from agonizing deaths. It took basically 4 girls being killed before they started to put 2 and 2 together. And again, Dr. Creed, being the helpful citizen that he was, he went and approached Scotland Yard and said, you've got some girls that are dying rather suspiciously. Let me tell you what I think is happening. He told them that he thought they were being poisoned by some rich men, that because they might be in a delicate situation and they were married men, that maybe, they should take that the men had helped these women to an early grave. Well, they questioned one girl before she died. Her name was Matilda Clover, and she had lived long enough to tell where she had got the pills from, and you guessed it, she got them from Dr. Neil Cream. Dr. Neil Cream was then prosecuted for the death of Matilda, found guilty, and on November 15th of 1892, he is taken to be executed. So at this point, they put the hood over his head and they put the noose around his neck. And right before they pull the lever that's going to hang him, that drops down that floor, he says, "I am Jack the," and then he dies. So if you look at the crime, he is saying that he was Jack the Ripper. He might have been doing this just so that they didn't pull the lever, that they stopped the execution right there, took him back and questioned him, just to make it last a little longer so he didn't die that day. If you looked at the timeline, Jack the Ripper's killings took place in 1888. From all accounts, Dr. Cream was still in prison at that time, but who knows? He might have got loose a little earlier. The final mystery to Daniel's death was his tombstone. It appeared in the middle of the night. His family members didn't know who put it up. He was a Mason, and they just kind of figured that he had some Masonic brothers who decided that they were going to put this tombstone. It is unusual because if you look all the way down, it says poisoned by his wife and Dr. Cream. I visited Daniel's grave, and his name is pretty much gone on the tombstone, as you can see by this picture that I took. And it says he died June 12th, 1881, age 61 years. And it's still the clearest thing on the tombstone is poisoned by his wife and Dr. Cream. I know acid rain goes from the top to the bottom, but I still think it's pretty cool that his wife, and it still says that right on there. Julia kind of disappears into obscurity. I tried to follow her path. There was not a lot to find. She kind of disappeared. She did have a daughter from a previous relationship, and she took her, and they just disappeared out of history, as it were. Okay. The next story that I'm going to talk about is, now I am not from this area. I moved here when I became an adult. I came here and I settled here and had my family here. And I love Rockford and Winnebago County. And I think it's a wonderful place to live. And it was such a great place to live in the 1800s that Jesus himself actually lived here in Winnebago County. So this story takes place a little before 1880. This is George Jacob Schweinfurth. Now, George started his religious life as being a janitor in a church. But his mother had always told him from the day he was born that she knew he was destined to be a great man and do great things. And George Jacob Schweinfurth believed this. So he meets up with a woman of the time in about 1877. He meets Dorinda Beekman. Now, Dorinda was a pastor's wife. They lived in the Byron area, and she decided that one day she told her husband, the pastor, that you may think you talk to God, but I know I talk to God. And she started her own religion, basically. They were called Beekmanites. Her husband didn't take very kindly to this, mind you. She kind of shoved him out of the way and went ahead and started her own thing. He ends up in an institution, a mental institution, so he didn't handle that real well at all. But Dorinda gets a lot of followers, and George comes to her, and he's from out east, but he, through the grapevine, had heard about Dorinda, and he came and he joined her religion. Now, Dorinda really felt like she was the reincarnated Jesus, and she felt like she could perform miracles, and she saw that this man had something about him that would drive women to join her cult. So he was really good at going out and getting more members for her church. So she embraced George, and he rose through her ranks pretty quickly. Now, Dorinda was an older woman, and she got ill. And she would tell people, I am going to rise from the dead just like Jesus did. And she gave them this elaborate ritual to follow. Put me out, lay me out, burn candles, pray over my body, and I will come back to you, just like Jesus did. So Dorinda passes away. Her followers lay her out, burn the candles. They're praying. Day goes by. Couple more days go by. After about a week, the health department gets involved because Dorinda's not looking or smelling too good, and they're a little worried about what this would be doing. So George has a vision that he is the new Dorinda. He is the new Jesus for this religion. So they buried Dorinda, and now her body, whatever, is in the ground, but George rises to the head of this religion. But Byron had had enough by then. They're like, we're not doing this anymore. So the religion looks around, and they find a very wealthy parishioner. He was a true follower of this religion. And he had 600-acre farm out on Weldon and Montague Road. This is what the house looked like. George was invited to move in. Bring your religion to this place. Your followers of yours, we will let you have our property. Right away, he mortgages the house to make it more appropriate for a place where he would live, because he's Jesus and he needs a nice house. Now, when I looked at this, I was so surprised as I was researching back into this. These were not simple folks that were following in this religion. This was the wives of doctors and lawyers and, really intelligent and educated people that were joining this religion. The wives would bring in the husbands, and sometimes the wives just left the husband if he didn't want to join. But the thing was, when you joined the church, You gave all of your worldly goods to George Jacob there, and because you wouldn't need anything, he would take care of your every need. He moved people into the house. Well, let me rephrase that. He moved the women into the house. The men stayed in the barn. They helped with the crops and the feeding. He bought horses. They started to breed horses and sell them. And he was making a lot of money between the parishioners giving him everything and these horses. The women stayed in the house, especially the pretty women. Now, this religion really embraced the Immaculate Conception thought. They really believed that Mary conceived a child of God. And so when some of the prettier parishioners started to spend time with George, it was believed that they were chosen by God to be angels of this church. Now, one of the angels of this church was Spencer Weldon's daughter, Mary, the girl on the left on the screen, the one in the chair. This is Mary Louise Weldon. As you can tell, she was very pretty. She was about 25 years old when this is all taking place. Now, George was a really good marketer. He was very good at promoting this religion. He had churches in Kansas City, and he would make his sermons from the house there on Weldon Farm. And people would transcribe what he said, and they would send it to the church that, and those pastors would just do the sermon just like George said to do it. He had women who would dance during the program, that very attractive women dancing around with they had nude stockings on, so it looked like they didn't have any pants on. So it really had it going on. The one thing that was a real stickler for some of these families, though, is George didn't see marriages after. When you joined the church, you gave up all of that. So marriages were no longer recognized. So if George had a young lady who might have been married previously, when she joined the flock, maybe she wasn't married anymore. And she became a special aid angel. And he had this Garden of Eden test. I don't even want to think about what that could have included, but they would pass this test, and then they became a special aid angel. Now, research has lost, the total number has been lost to time, but I found three women who gave birth to four children during this time period, and Mary Louise was one of them. Mary Louise's daughter that she had with George is on the right. Her name was Myrtle. She would grow up on the farm too. So all of this is going on. People are visiting, people are coming into the flock, but people are also leaving the flock. Some of the husbands got a little tired of being these doctors who are now sleeping in a barn as their wives are entertained by George Jacob Schweinfurth. And some of them started to sue to get their money back, to get their wives back, to get their families back. They took him to court. Rockford was kind of watching this whole thing, and Winnebago County finally had had enough. And so they decided that they would take certain people to court. Mary was one of them. Aurora was his head angel, and George Schweinfurth himself. They took him into court for immoral practices. They were found guilty, but before sentencing, George decided that he would marry one of them, and the paper speculated which one it would be. Spencer Weldon was asked how he felt about his daughter having a child with George, and he said, "Oh, it's not a child of George; it is a child of God." And he was very honored that God would choose his daughter in order to bring forth life. it did say in the newspaper that George had a little tint of red to his hair, and it was kind of suspicious how all of the children had a little tint of red. So this is George's picture with his two children that he had. This is his head angel, Aurora. They're a little older here. George decided that being Jesus was getting to be a tough gig, and he decided he wanted to move on to other prospects. So about 1900, he left the farm, which had now been known as Heaven. It was called the Heaven, and he left that in 1900, and he moved to Chicago. He changed his name, and in case you ever want to know what happens if Jesus decides to really walk among us, he became a real estate salesman. That's what Jesus did after he left Winnebago. Now, this is the Weldon property today, still very elaborate, still owned by a member of the Weldon family. It's a working farm. In all of this, people ask me why I thought this was a crime. Well, he got a lot of money, kind of swindled people out of it. But really, the reason I was so attracted to this story was Mary Weldon herself. And I wanted to follow her path and see where it took me. Mary Weldon, young lady, 25 years old, and she becomes involved with Jesus. So where do you go after that? What happens to you? How did she marry somebody? Can you marry somebody after being with somebody so holy? So I was curious on what her story was. And she actually ended up moving out to the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, and got basically involved in the Church of Scientology. And her family is not really sure if she's buried in Winnebago, little cemetery of Winnebago, with her father and the rest of the family, or if she's buried out there. When I contacted them to ask, her name is on the tombstone in Winnebago Cemetery. You can see it there, but they're not sure if she's there or if she's out in the Pacific Northwest. And as far as I can tell, Mary never married, so she never got over that relationship. Myrtle went on and became quite respected young lady, and she was a teacher, and she has a building named after her in Kentucky at a university. All right. So one of the theories in the paranormal world, as it were, and I am by no means, I tell people this all the time, I am not an expert on the paranormal anything. I've been dealing with live people a lot longer than I've been dealing with dead people, and I can't figure out the live ones at all. So don't consider me an expert. Sometimes it seems to me when you study these stories, there are certain things that allow for energy to come through easier. And sometimes I think when violent things happen in an area, it leaves like an imprint, and that makes it a little easier for the paranormal world to break through that veil. So that's what led into I started looking up and researching stories, because I saw a correlation between that. When I would hear about a story and start researching that area, certain things had happened in that area. And this is a case in point. This is a murder that took place in 1910 here in Rockford. I know the pictures are really faded. They came through the newspaper. This is Mary McIntosh, and she lived on West State Street, not too far, right across the street from where the Crusaders Clinic is. And she and her husband had built this lovely little house. He was a carpenter, and they lived there very happily. But he passed away, and they were from Scotland, and so she had this lovely brogue to her voice, and she was well loved in the neighborhood. But after her husband passed away, she became a little hesitant to let people into her home, and she was afraid that she was going to get swindled, and rightly so. He had left her with quite a lot of money, and she was swindled a little bit, so that kind of made her a little shy, and she became basically a recluse and unfortunately a hoarder. And her house was pretty much full of garbage, except the one room that she lived in. Basically, stayed in the living room, slept in the recliner chair, and kept that area clean. But the rest of her house was packed full of things. So in 1910, this is the diagram of their home. In 1910, you could say it was around Forest Avenue and State Street. She was getting her groceries delivered and her milk delivered. The grocery boy, the boy who delivered her groceries, showed up and he noticed some bloody footprints, but he just walked over them, opened the back door, put the groceries in, shut the back door, left. But the milkman, when he came, he was supposed to leave the milk in that room so that Mary would get up off of her chair and go and put it away right away. When he went to leave the milk in, he couldn't open the door. He pushed, and realized that Mary's body was laying in front of the door, and that's why he couldn't open it fully. So he runs to the pharmacy down the street and tells the pharmacist that he thought Mary had fallen and hurt herself. I don't know why he didn't call the police, but he did that. Now, in the meantime, the mailman that works in that area is walking along on his route, and he starts noticing some envelopes on this path that he walks, and they were all addressed to Mary McIntosh. So he'd pick them up, and he ended up taking them to the police department. So all of this is happening at the same time. The police rush to Mary's house, and they push open that door, and they realize that Mary had not died from a fall or an accident. Unfortunately for Mary, she had been murdered, horribly murdered. Not that anyone's nicely murdered, but she had been smacked on the head right above her eye and fallen, and then she had been disemboweled. Horrible scene greeted these men as they looked down at this woman who could have been any of their mothers or grandmothers. They started an investigation. One of their biggest clues was a letter that they found. Like I mentioned, letters had been found all around the area, but this letter was not addressed to Mary. It was written in a couple of places, and it was found on the front sidewalk there. It was a letter to a man named Fred, and it was signed Bertha. So police, being really smart that they are, they decided to go to the address on the envelope. It was to Fred. Now, he lived in Stoneman Valley. So they went to talk to him and said, "Hey, who's this Bertha who's writing you?" And he said, "That's Bertha St. Clair. And she has a husband. His name is Clinton. And he's looking for a job. So she was asking me if I had anything for Clinton to do." Now, they go to Clinton's house to talk to Bertha to find out why this letter is on the front step of a murdered woman's home. They go in and they start looking around, and they find some bloody clothing, and they find some other letters to Mary in this house. So they ask Clinton, "Did you know Mary?" And he said, "No, not really." And they said, "Did you happen to go to her house last night?" And he said, "Well, yeah." And they said, "What did you do there?" Now, Clinton was not a smart man. And he said, "Well, I hadn't worked in a little while. I had been to a party with my wife. She decided to stay at the party. I decided to go home, and I was passing Mary's house, and I thought maybe I could get some money from Mary." So he broke into her house and he whacked her on the head and took her money. He got about $60 worth of money. He didn't mention why he thought he needed to disembowel her, though. They put Clinton on trial. This is Clinton from the paper. They put Clinton on trial, and his defense came up with this brilliant brilliant scheme. Clinton had been bitten by a mad dog when he was a kid, and so that was their defense, that this bite that he had when he was a child had eventually driven him crazy, and he killed. Didn't get him very far. He was sentenced to hang. Now, Clinton would be the last public hanging that we had in Winnebago County. And back then, we didn't hang people a lot. So this took place over many, many years. And since we didn't hang people a lot, what you would do is basically call the people in Chicago. They would bring the stockade to build. They would put the gallows up in the day, and you would, hang the guy. So during this time before, I don't think Clinton really thought he was going to hang, because he was kind of jovial guy after the sentencing until it got really close. Now, he killed Mary on January 20th. April 15th is when they hung him. Now, like I said, the man came, he built the gallows, and he waited around because he had another appointment in another city that he was going to move on to. So they bring Clinton out. He was a big guy. So they decided they needed to make sure that things went well. So here is an actual picture from Midway Village of them practicing. They have it tied around a, I don't know, flour bag, something like that. So they made sure, because you needed to have the weight just right and how far you dropped, because you wanted to make sure that he died quickly. And that's why they practice. So this being like I said, the fourth hanging, the first one was very chaotic and happened in 1857. Over 8,000 people showed up. It was a mess. So this time what they did, after that, actually, the second, third, and fourth one, they built a stockade around it. And this next picture, there we go, shows you, this is the jail. Behind it stands the fancy courthouse that used to stand on West State Street. They've built a stockade, and they issued tickets. You would apply for the ticket to go to the hanging. 200 tickets. They had over 1,000 people sign up for these tickets to try to get them. And most of them were women. So they hang him. Everything goes great. The man that built the stockade said it was the best hanging he ever attended. So we got a gold star for that one. When I was doing this story, I was getting photos for the book, Murder and Mayhem, that I wrote. And Laura Furman, who is the curator of Midway Village Museum, asked me, she said, we have a display in the jail here of Clinton Sinclair, and we happen to have the rope he was hung with. She said, would you like to see it? And I said, no. And then I thought, well, it is for the book. So I did. She opened it up. I took the picture, and there you go. That's the actual rope that Clinton Sinclair was hung with. Now, again, as in the other story that I told, you would think this was the end of it, that murder victim is in her grave, Clinton is in his grave, all is well with the world, justice has been served. Not exactly how it went. Clinton Sinclair, before his hanging, grew very agitated. I mean, he's looking death in the face as they're building his gallows, and he would burst into tears or laughter. He'd pace, and it was just very, very evident to everyone around him this was a man who was not resting easily. Well, it seems that continued even after Clinton's hanging. Jailers at the jail started to notice all of a sudden nobody wanted to be in their cell alone. They actually asked if they could bunk with other people. It was unheard of. These cells were small. Everybody wanted their own cell, but not during this time. They said they kind of talked about how crime dropped dramatically during this time after Clinton's hanging. And they said that it must be because the hanging showed people what would happen if they broke the crime, broke the law. And the jailers knew that's not what was going on. And the prisoners knew it was because they would often hear in Clinton's cell the sound of shuffling feet as he paces and continued to pace, I guess, until they tore it down, pace back and forth. They would hear sobbing, they would hear laughter. Now, that jail is long gone. But if you happen to be passing downtown Rockford and you are by that bust of Lincoln on Church Street in West State or Elm Street that lie there, and it's late at night and it's quiet, you might hear the sound of laughter or sobbing, or the sound of many feet shuffling as people try to see the hanging of this St. Clair. All right, moving on. So I have been researching the woman in white stories. A lot of people claim that downtown area is really haunted by this woman in white. She has been seen in the Coronado. She has been seen in the parking garage across the Coronado. She is seen around the river. So I have been looking for this woman to identify her, to give her identity back. Unfortunately, a lot of women, for some reason, decided to drown themselves in the Rock River. A lot of them right in the downtown area. I was telling this story at a Kiwanis luncheon a couple of years ago, and I had before I started talking. They usually let me have lunch with them or whatever, breakfast. So I was talking to the people that were sitting at my table, and a guy said, "Do you really believe in this stuff?" And I said, "Absolutely." And he said, "Well, okay, I've got a story for you." He said, "Maybe you can help me find the identity of this person." And I said, "Okay, I'll give it a shot. Go ahead." And he says, "I had a visit in the middle of the night." He said, "I don't know why I woke up, but all of a sudden the room got really cold. And as I looked at the foot of the bed, a light started to glow. And a young boy stepped out of the darkness into that light. He was little. And he said, I wasn't scared. I just didn't know what was happening. So I was startled." And he said, "And as I was watching this young boy, first a hand appeared on the young boy's shoulder, and then a woman stepped out of the darkness. And they both just looked at this man who was laying in what should have been a safe place for him. And the expression on the woman's face was moving." He said it just really touched him because she looked so depressed and so sad that it really touched him. And he said they faded away, and he got out of bed and looked around, and there was nothing there. And I said, "Well, where do you live?" And he said, "I live by the Rockford Country Club." And immediately, this next story that I'm going to tell you rose to my mind because it happened right in that area. The story takes place in 1925. And just a side note there, the picture that is on this one is not of any cemetery here in Rockford. Again, it's actually St. Louis, but it fit this story, so I wanted to use it. So this story takes place. Some of you know that we had Harlem Park here, an amusement park that sat on the west side of town and right down across from like where Rockford Country Club is, across the river. So one day in July of 1925, the people that were down there at the amusement park were horrified to see the body of a woman floating in the water. They noticed that her gown was ripped. She had a dark skirt on, long, of course, at that time, that period, it was all the way to the ground. And they brought her up, and when they turned her over, her face, her nose, her mouth was completely full of mud. She had actually been in the bottom of the river. They take her body to the coroner's office, and he could tell that she had drowned, but there's no identification on this woman. They go through her pockets, and in the pocket of her apron, or the pocket of her skirt, they find a rosary and a prayer book. So the only thing that the coroner can think to do to get this woman identified is to bring the priests from Rockford in to view this woman. So her face is cleaned off. She's laid out on the table, and the priests start showing up, and they pass through. And one of them actually recognizes this woman. She hadn't been to church for a long time, but he recognized her as Josephine Dunn. She had been recently married a couple years to James Dunn. She had been married previously to a man and had a son named Arthur by this man. But he passed away, and she inherited a nice house and married this James, who had also been married and had children with another woman, but who had passed away. So they blended household kind of a deal going on with them. The priests say that, you know, this is Josie Dunn, and she lived on Summit Street, and so they go to the house, and they enter the home. It wasn't locked, and they enter the home, and they said it was so eerie because there on the table was another set of rosary beads and a letter. And they said it looked like that she had just stepped out of the room when they walked in. Now, meantime, they're also contacting family members, and they're also searching all around Harlem Park, and they find a blanket, a woman's hat, and a little boy's pair of shoes, and a letter. And the letter states, this is the family we just talked about. There's little Arthur was the 8-year-old son. There's Josie Dunn and her husband, James. And this letter that they find says, in the deep blue waters, you will find me. When they go to speak to Josie's mom, she said that she had a horrible nightmare the night before, and that she could hear Josie screaming for her. And there was nothing she could do. She tried to call Josie first thing in the morning, and she wasn't at her house. She made her way over to the apartment. The apartment was empty, and the woman didn't know what to do. She had such a bad feeling. It stayed with her all day until the police showed up at her apartment. And she said, I know Josie's dead, but where is Arthur? Now, the police did not realize that Josie even had a son at that time until they questioned her mother. So they go back down to the river and they start looking for him, and they don't find him. Unfortunately, I wish they would have, because the next day, some little boys that weren't much bigger than Arthur himself, who were caddies for the country club, found little Arthur's body floating in the water. Now, they brought him up and buried him, and this is the headlines for the next day. They found the little boy. What they figure she did was taken him for a day at Harlem Park, one last day together. And then she convinced him to go in waiting, and she held him under the water. So this is one of the people that I think might have been the woman in white that's haunting. And as you can tell, anybody would be a tortured spirit who would have done that to their own child. This story is a little bit lighter. Now, everybody has probably heard the Resurrection Mary story. So this story actually predates that one, and I was thrilled when I found this story in the paper, in the Rockford paper. It tells the story of this young lady. There was a couple that was coming from Chicago's Columbian Exposition in 1933, in the summer of 1933. They were coming back from it really late at night. They're passing Belvedere, and they see on the road a young lady who's in a very fancy dress. So they stop and they said, "Do you need a ride?" And she said, "Yes, I would appreciate that." She jumps in the car and they're chatting. And she says she's Mrs. Johnson. She gave her address, and they start to go back to Rockford. And she was very excited about this party that she had attended. She talked about her pretty dress and her friends and that she had so much fun at this party. But then the couple, it was late and they were tired, and the woman kind of slowed down talking, and she hadn't said anything for a few minutes. So the wife turns around to look in the back seat, and there's nobody there. They pull over quickly. They don't find anybody there, but they kind of look at each other and they don't know what to do. So they get back in the car, they drive home, but they don't sleep much that night. So the next day they get up and they drive to the address that this woman had given them. And they question the man. They knock on the door. It's opened by a young man. And he said, "There's no Mrs. Johnson here anymore, but she lived here before. She was killed in an accident." And the couple was dumbfounded. So when I read this story, I was happy that I found a really cool ghost story. But I also I started going backwards, and I found that the year before, a young woman named Mrs. Johnson had been killed while walking on that same highway. It was called the Grant Highway back then. It's Highway 20. She had been out drinking. She had left her two small children at home by themselves, had gone out drinking with some friends, and apparently they were driving back and decided that they had had too much to drink to drive, so they parked their car and started walking on the road, and they got hit, and she died. The last article I can find talks about how the police were looking for family members to find out what to do with these children because they were wards of the state, basically, at that point. So we had not a Resurrection Mary, but we had a Mrs. Johnson, the ghost of they called her the hitchhiking wraith. And lots of people picked her up along the way during that time period. They would pick up Mrs. Johnson and try to get her home, but she's still trying to get there. This one involves a murder from 1929. This is Cordellia Gummerscheimer, and she was the kind of woman that I know I wish I could meet. She was very talented. She was a teacher. She was a language teacher at the high school here in town. She would spend her off days. She was trying to get a master's degree and through Madison, so she spent her summers going there. But the summer previous to this, in the summer of 1929, she took off that summer from going to school, and she went to Cuba and was sort of like the interpreter for them to take this trip. So she got to see some wonderful things. She also worked for businessmen who were dealing with the Latin communities because she would interpret the letters and help them write letters to these businessmen. And she was very popular. She had lots of men who were interested in her because of all of her dealings, but she was engaged to a young man in New York City. So Cordelia's life was going well. She lived in a apartment house that is right about where the bus stop is, or the bus depot is downtown on West State Street. Her friends were a little, like, a little cautious about living in a place like that. They said that, Cordelia, usually the teachers lived together, but she wanted to be on her own. So she rented this apartment, and she loved the house. She would tutor her students there. She loved the little apartment, and she would tutor her students. But one day when her friends were coming to have dinner with her, she didn't answer the door. So they went up to the back, and to their horror, they find Cordelia laying out on her bed. She had been struck 3 times on the head. And this man here is holding the weapon. So her crime was never solved. And in fact, they had too many clues. She had students that had graduated that had tried to court her. So they even said that it might be a woman who had lost her boyfriend to Cordelia through the years. This man was arrested shortly after Cordelia's murder. This is Floyd Leach. Floyd Leach was a dentist here in Rockford whose office was very close to Cordelia's house or apartment, the back of her apartment. He had been seen sitting in his car, staring up in that general direction. And so he was arrested. And when they went to question him, they arrested him. And when they looked in his car, he had bodies of dead animals in his car. And when they searched him, when they brought him in for questioning, in his coat pocket, they found the body of a little tiny mouse. So they questioned Floyd and they asked him, why do you have these things? And he said he was very interested in taxidermy and that he was using the pelts to make a rug for his shack. As they researched into this man, they found out that he used to be a dentist to the stars out in Hollywood, but he had run into some trouble with his wife and he deserted her and he moved to Rockford and started a practice here. They couldn't put any time together. They couldn't even decide if they knew each other, Cordelia and Leach, Dr. Leach. So they had to let him go. Needless to say, Dr. Leach's practice, his dental practice, suffered. Mainly because not the taxidermy, not the making of the rug, but when they asked him why he had a mouse in his pocket, he said he just liked to touch the fur. It felt nice. Well, I guess the thought of him petting a dead animal kind of turned people off of him sticking his fingers on their mouth because it dropped off. His practice really dropped. Unfortunately, Cordelia's murder was never solved, and her family came and took her back to Belleville, Illinois, where she was from. Now, Rockford, because they couldn't solve this crime themselves, they wanted to put this out. So they put this in the newspaper. And if you came up with the right solution for this mystery, you would win $10, or you got to go to the Palace Theater with tickets to the Runners Up, as long as you solved it by the January 27th. She was killed on December 9th of 1929. So this would have been January the next year. So nobody found that out. So nobody got that $10 prize. Our last little story is a story that I just recently researched. It takes place in Beloit. This is the Lee home. Now it stands on Bluff Street in Beloit. Bluff Street is one of the first streets that was settled there in Beloit, and this home was by 1937 had existed for a long time. They actually had fallen into some disrepair. It had been a wealthy family whose family members had died out and they had hit some hard times. So they rented rooms for a while. After that, last family member died away, and nobody wanted the upkeep of the house. So the house was tore down, and in 1936, that's when this process started. They decided they were going to build a Veterans Memorial Hall there. Mrs. Grinnell had donated $100,000 to the city of Beloit to build this hall in the memory of her son, or husband. And he had fought in the Civil War, and then he started the Beloit Iron Works. So they had lots of money. She gave $100,000 to build this home. So they decided they had to make way for this new Grinnell Center. So they tore down the Lee home. When they tore it down, they found a little tin. The men who were actually doing the tearing down found this little tin, and they opened it up. And when they opened it up, they found the body of a little tiny bird nestled in cotton in the wall. So there were two postcards. On the back of one, it said, "To whoever finds this was Dickie. And Dickie was my bird, and he was a beautiful, knowing friend. And please bury him back where you found him." The other one gave a poem it was written to Dickie about him being such a lovely bird. And it was signed with the initials NC. Well, the man who was head of the demolition team, Paul Kennedy, was intrigued by this. So he put in the paper, "Does anybody know who NC could be?" And a lady came forward and said, "I think that's my friend, Nellie Clark. And she used to live in the Lee home. And it sounds like something she would do. She had lots of pets. She loved animals." So this Paul Kennedy decided that he would put Dickie back in his little coffin that had the word Dickie scratched on the top. It's a little cracker tin thing. And when he built the new Grinnell Memorial Hall, he placed Dickie back inside the walls. This is what the Grinnell Hall looked like afterwards. And it seems that Dickie is still there because people who use it has now changed its purpose. It went from being a place that honored and helped veterans to a place now. It's the Grinnell Senior Center. It's a very lively place. There's lots going on. They serve lunches there. There's games there. There's trips arranged through there. But sometimes they hear Dickie. They hear the fluttering of wings. They hear the chirping of a little bird inside. And at first they would go and look for it because they were sure that a little bird had gotten caught in there, but they never could find anything. So they think that Dickie is just letting them know he's still around. And also Nellie, they feel the presence of a young lady that she's seen out of the corner of their eye walking through the halls, just a little beyond. When they turn to look at her directly, they don't see her, but just out of the corner of the eye, they'll see a flash of a woman in a long dress walking through. And they are so intrigued and so charmed by this and feel her presence is a good thing. They have a little secondhand shop when you walk into the front doors of the Grinnell Senior Center. And this little shop is like a secondhand shop, and it's called Nellie's Nook, as in to honor Nellie and the fact that they like having her there. They feel that her presence is a good thing. So just a little happier note to leave you with than all the other gruesome stories I told you. Well, I thank you very much for listening as I chatted away. You can find my books through the Rockford Public Library if you go and look on our website. Next week's Lunch and Learn will feature our extraordinary historian, G. Lithgow, and she'll be talking about genealogical sources through the library and some things that you can find. Thank you very much for attending. I will be back to talk about Stories Beneath the Stones on July 15th at 6 p.m. through the WebEx. And we'll be talking about some of the stories that I found in local small cemeteries. So thank you very much. Andrew?
Okay, if you have a question for Kathy, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask away, or you can utilize the chat feature.
Andrew, how do I see the chats? Are you going to read them to me or? Oh. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, Kathy. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Jean. That means a lot. You're welcome, Samantha. Thank you for joining.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated it.
Thank you. Thanks, Erica. Thanks, Amber.
Can I make a little comment? This is Linnell.
Sure.
My great great grandfather built Morris Hall, the biggest hall in Byron, back in the late 1870s. And when I was looking up to see what was going on there, I saw that every Sunday Reverend J.C. Beekman was having his services there in 79, up till 79. And then right the next year, by February of 80, it's now saying there's no more services going on at his hall. Instead, Reverend George Schweinfurth is giving Sunday services at the public school, and Mrs. Beekman has Bible readings on Fridays at her home. So that got me reading about Beekmanism and then about Schweinfurth. It was interesting to run into it that way.
Thank you for sharing that with me.
Hi, Kathy. Thank you so much for your presentation. This is Tracy.
Thank you, Tracy.
About 15 years ago, my sister and I went on a haunted Chicago tour, and a lot of the hauntings were, as could be suspected, connected to the mob. And I was wondering if you had noticed any like mob activity or had any mob stories out in the Rockford area.
Yes, in fact, the previous presentation that I did was on the Prohibition time period. You can find that on the Rockford Public Library's YouTube channel now, and you can listen to that presentation that talks about that specific topic. Thank you for that question, Tracy.
Hi, Kathy, it's Leslie. I just want to correct that. The Mafia is not posted on the YouTube channel yet.
I think it is now, though. The mob one is, but I think that I thought I went on this morning and found the Prohibition one. But keep checking if it isn't. It will be soon.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Leslie.
Thanks, Kathy. I enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. Any other questions, comments, any sharing? Thank you again so much, everybody, for joining me. I hope you learned a little bit of history and enjoyed the mystery part of it. And like I said, please join us next week for the Lunch and Learn with Jean Lithgow, same time. And thank you very much for Leslie for inviting me to speak today and for Andrew for being our host.